In 1870, the American prairie was silent, not peaceful, silent, the kind of silence that follows destruction. Tens of millions of bison had once moved across the Great Plains like a living storm, shaking the ground, reshaping the land, feeding entire civilizations. Within 2 decades, they were gone, hunted to the edge of extinction. What was left behind wasn't just emptiness. It was a broken ecosystem, soil compacted, grasses dying, rivers shifting, wildlife vanishing in a chain reaction no one fully understood at the time. Then, in a quiet government decision that drew almost no public attention, 414 bison were placed onto land that scientists were privately calling dead. Not struggling, not recovering, dead. The soil had lost its structure. The native grasses were gone. The predator networks had collapsed. Ecologists weren't even sure the land could support the herd through a single winter. But something happened. Something that took 150 years to fully reveal itself. And when researchers finally began documenting what had returned, what had quietly rebuilt itself beneath the surface of that forgotten prairie, the findings didn't just surprise them. They changed how scientists understand ecosystems entirely. This is the story of what 414 bison did to a dead landscape, and why no one saw it coming. The year was 1905, and the American government was facing an uncomfortable truth. The bison were almost gone, not dwindling, not declining, almost gone, where an estimated 30 to 60 million animals had once roamed freely across North America. Fewer than 1,000 remained, scattered, isolated, barely surviving in fragmented pockets of land. The slaughter had been systematic. Hunters moved across the plains in organized waves, sometimes killing thousands in a single day. Hides were stripped. Carcasses were left to rot under the open sky. The federal government had not only allowed it, in many cases, they had quietly encouraged it. Eliminating the bison meant eliminating the primary food source of the plains tribes, and with it, a way of life that had lasted thousands of years. But by the early 1900s, even officials who had supported the hunts were beginning to understand something unsettling. The land itself was dying. Soil erosion was accelerating across the Central Plains. River systems were shifting. Native grasses that had evolved over millennia alongside the bison were thinning, replaced by invasive species and bare, compacted earth. Ranchers who had celebrated the disappearance of wild bison were now watching their own cattle struggle on land that no longer supported the weight of heavy grazing. The connection wasn't fully understood yet, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. In 1905, a small coalition of conservationists, led by figures including William Hornaday, founded the American Bison Society. Their goal was radical for its time: bring the bison back. What they didn't yet know was what the land had lost while the bison were gone, and how deep that damage actually ran. The plan looked simple on paper. Take bison from the last surviving captive herds, transport them to federal land in Oklahoma, a stretch of prairie called the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge, release them, and hope. In October 1907, 15 bison arrived by rail in wooden crates. They were followed by additional transfers over the next several years, eventually building the population to what officials recorded as 414 animals across restored federal grasslands. It was the first deliberate, large-scale wildlife reintroduction in American history. But the land they were released onto wasn't the prairie those animals had evolved alongside. It was a shadow of it. Decades of uncontrolled cattle grazing had compacted the soil so severely that rainwater no longer absorbed properly. It ran off the surface in sheets, carrying topsoil into creek beds. The native grasses, the deep-rooted blue stem and grama that had once stretched horizon to horizon, had been largely replaced by shorter, weaker vegetation. Ecologists at the time had no framework for understanding what had been lost. They thought grass was grass. They were wrong. What they didn't realize was that the entire prairie ecosystem had been built around the bison, not just supported by them. The animals didn't simply graze the land. They engineered it. Their hooves broke compacted soil. Their wallowing created shallow depressions that collected rainwater. Their movement patterns prevented any single area from being overgrazed. Remove the bison, and the whole system slowly unraveled. But what no one predicted, not the conservationists, not the ecologists, not the government officials overseeing the program, was how the land would respond once the bison came back, and how violent that response would be. The first decade looked like failure. The herd survived, but the land didn't visibly improve. Rangers at Wichita Mountains watched the bison move across the refuge and saw what looked like further damage. Patches of earth torn up, vegetation trampled flat, shallow pits dug into ground that was already fragile. To untrained eyes, it looked like the animals were finishing what the cattle had started. Several officials pushed to reduce the herd size. The bison, they argued, were accelerating the erosion, not reversing it. What those officials didn't understand was that they were watching a process that operated on a timeline no quarterly report could measure. Beneath the surface, something was already shifting. The bison's hooves, cracking compacted soil with every step, were creating microscopic channels that hadn't existed in decades. Channels that allowed water to move down instead of running off. The wallows the animals carved into the earth began collecting rainwater. Within those shallow pools, aquatic insects returned. Then amphibians. Then the birds that fed on them. A cascade had begun. But it was invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Then, in the 1930s, something happened that reframed everything. The Dust Bowl hit the Great Plains with devastating force. Millions of acres of unprotected topsoil were stripped away by wind and drought. Entire farming communities were buried. The ecological damage was described by government surveyors as some of the worst land degradation ever recorded in North America. But inside the Wichita Mountains refuge, the land held. Soil that should have blown away didn't. Researchers who investigated the difference found something they hadn't expected, and it pointed directly at the bison. The soil inside the refuge was different, not slightly different, fundamentally different. Researchers pulling core samples in the years following the Dust Bowl found that the earth beneath bison grazing land had retained a microbial complexity that surrounding prairie had completely lost. Bacteria, fungi, organisms so small they had no common names. A living underground network rebuilt quietly over 3 decades by nothing more than hoof pressure, dung, and the natural movement patterns of a herd. The bison hadn't just grazed the land, they had been slowly rebuilding its immune system. But the discovery created an uncomfortable question. If the land inside the refuge had survived the Dust Bowl because of the bison, what did that mean for the millions of acres outside it that had no bison at all? Government soil surveyors began comparing data. The results were difficult to publish without controversy. Land adjacent to the refuge, land that had been managed, irrigated, fertilized, and carefully maintained by ranchers and agricultural departments, was measurably less stable than land that had simply been left to the bison. Some ranchers refused to accept the findings. A few called the surveys politically motivated. One agricultural official in Oklahoma privately documented his own shock in a report that sat buried in federal archives for decades, only recovered and published by historians in the early 2000s. His notes described the refuge soil as behaving in ways that existing agricultural science couldn't fully explain. He used one phrase repeatedly: "The land is alive again." But what no one had tracked, what no one had even thought to measure until the 1990s, was what was happening above the soil, in the grasses, in the root systems, in the sky above the refuge, and the scale of it was something no one had anticipated. By the 1990s, ecologists had a new set of tools: satellite imaging, soil spectrometry, long-range wildlife tracking. And when they turned those tools toward the Wichita Mountains refuge, toward the land where those original 414 bison had been released nearly a century earlier, what they documented was difficult to process. The native bluestem grasses had returned, not partially, not in isolated patches. Across thousands of acres, The deep-rooted grass systems that had been declared functionally extinct in the region were growing again, rebuilt from dormant seed banks that had survived underground for decades, waiting for the right conditions the bison had quietly recreated. But the grasses were only part of it. Bird species not recorded in the region for over 60 years had reappeared. Elk populations that researchers assumed were permanently gone had drifted back through natural migration corridors that the recovering grassland had reopened. Even the water table had shifted. Streams that had run dry or reduced to seasonal trickles were flowing again, fed by soil that could now absorb and hold rainfall the way it once had. One ecologist who spent 15 years studying the refuge described the transformation in the 2004 paper with language that was unusually direct for academic writing. He wrote that the prairie had not simply recovered, it had remembered. The biological memory of the ecosystem, encoded in dormant seeds, surviving fungi, fragmented insect populations, had been waiting. Not for human intervention, not for scientific management, for the return of the one animal the entire system had been built around. 414 bison onto dead land. 150 years later, a prairie that breathes again. The question that remains, the one ecologists are still debating, is how many other dead landscapes across this continent are still waiting for the same thing, and whether we'll make the decision in time